I'm Nathan, and welcome to the Cheating Tales Lab. How's your days been, or how it's going? Let me know in the comment. Now let's begin this tale. Owen Maynard was not a man who communicated in volume. He'd learned early, first from a father who came home from his own service with a particular quietness that never left, and then from a military career that refined it into precision, that measured words hit harder than loud ones. He was 31 years old, a staff sergeant in the U.S. Army with 2 tours behind him and a third loading in the chamber, when his wife of 8 years sat across the kitchen table and told him she was done. She'd met someone. His name was Alvin Nixon. He worked in finance in Atlanta and wore the kind of shoes that required a discussion, and he had never been asked to do anything that cost him anything real. Charlene had met him at a function hosted by her mother, who had been engineering a quiet exit from this marriage for the better part of 4 years. Owen nodded once. He asked about Celeste. Charlene said the courts would sort it out. They did. Celeste Ann Maynard, 9 years old, with her father's dark, still eyes and his particular quality of watching the room instead of performing for it, was awarded to her mother's primary custody. Owen's visitation generous on paper and subject to the operational constraints of being a soldier. He took every weekend the schedule allowed. He showed up to every school event he was on the continent for. He called every Sunday at 7 o'clock, and if he was deployed and couldn't call, he wrote letters that Celeste kept in a shoebox under her bed, sorted by postmark. Gail Rivers had never liked Owen Maynard. Not when Charlene brought him home the first time, not when he proposed, not at the wedding, not after. He was too contained, too unremarkable, too lacking in the particular kind of ambition that announced itself loudly at dinner parties. He drove a 10-year-old truck. He thought tablecloths were for holidays only. When Gail made pointed comments about the nature of military careers, Owen had a specific way of not reacting that she found more insulting than an argument would have been. After the divorce, the dislike curdled into something that required a more deliberate name. Gail had watched her daughter rebuild her life with Alvin Nixon, the right kind of man, finally. And the one persistent intrusion from the previous chapter was the child, who looked so completely, stubbornly, unapologetically like Owen Maynard that Gail sometimes felt the room contract when Celeste walked into it. She had told Charlene this privately, on several occasions. Charlene had said nothing useful in response. That was the thing about Charlene. She had many opinions and very little spine when it came to acting on them, especially when the alternative was disagreeing with her mother. Owen shipped out for his 3rd tour in October. Celeste was 16. He talked to her the week before he left, and she'd been quiet in the way she sometimes was when something was working in the back of her mind, something she wasn't ready to bring to the surface yet. He'd noted it and left it alone. She was his daughter. He respected her process. He was 7,000 miles away when December arrived. Celeste packed a bag for Christmas. She wrapped the gifts she'd bought, something for her mother, something for Alvin's younger brother who would be visiting, something small and deliberate for Gail, because she had been raised to try even when trying wasn't reciprocated. She took the bus across the city, 42 minutes in gray winter light, and walked the 4 blocks to her mother's house with the suitcase rolling behind her. Gail opened the door. She looked at Celeste the way she always did, that measured inventory, taking in the jaw and the eyes and the set of the shoulders. And then she said that Celeste wouldn't be coming inside this year. She said it calmly, the way someone states weather. She said Celeste looked too much like her father, and it upset the family. And with everyone gathered together, it wasn't a good time. Celeste said, "What?" Gail said it again without revision. Celeste looked past her. Her mother was standing in the hallway, half in and half out of the living room doorway, wearing a new Christmas sweater. Charlene looked at her daughter with an expression Celeste would spend years trying to correctly identify. Not guilt exactly, not cruelty exactly, something more like the passive embarrassment of a person who had decided that the discomfort of standing up for someone wasn't worth the domestic cost. She did not say anything. She did not step forward. She stood in the hallway and let the door close. Celeste stood on the porch. The temperature was 30 degrees. She had $14 in her jacket pocket, a bus pass, a suitcase, and a phone she considered pulling out to call someone before understanding that there was no one to call. Her father was overseas. Her school friends were with their families. She stood on the porch and breathed the cold air in and out slowly, in the deliberate way she had learned from Owen, and then she picked up the suitcase and started walking. The church was 3 blocks from her mother's house, a mid-sized congregation with a wooden sign that needed repainting and a nativity scene on the lawn that Celeste had walked past every Christmas since she could walk. The side door was unlocked. She pushed it open and found herself in the back of a service already in motion. Every pew was full except the last one. She sat down. She put the suitcase beside her and folded her hands and stared at the middle distance, where a choir was performing with more sincerity than technical precision, and the candles along the walls were burning steadily, and the air smelled like wood and wax and old hymnals. It was warm. She focused on the warmth. She didn't hear the woman sit down beside her. She became aware of her the way you become aware of something that has been there quietly long enough to earn its presence. The woman was in her mid-50s, with gray threaded naturally through dark hair, and the kind of face that had accumulated its expression honestly over decades of being present in difficult rooms. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and looked at the altar and did not, at any point, turn to examine Celeste or ask what was wrong or comment on the suitcase. After several minutes, she reached over and placed her hand over Celeste's. She didn't say anything. She just held it. They sat that way through the rest of the service, through the closing hymn and the benediction and the slow extinguishing of the candles. And when the congregation began to disperse and the cold air bled in through the opening main doors, the woman turned to Celeste and said she had a pot roast that had been in the oven since noon, and more pie than one person had any business attempting, and asked if Celeste would like to come for dinner. Her name was Lillian Farmer. She had been a school counselor for 26 years before retiring. She had been widowed 3 years prior. Her husband, a quiet man named Roland, who had loved this choir specifically, had died of a cardiac event that gave no warning. She came to this church on Christmas Eve because it made the room feel less empty. She had no children. She had a large yellow house and an orange cat named Gerald, and the particular self-sufficiency of someone who had built a life sturdy enough to weather things without needing to be held up. She had looked at a girl in the last pew with a suitcase beside her and done the arithmetic quickly and entirely correctly. She didn't ask for the details. She just opened the door. The yellow house was 12 minutes away. It had a covered porch with a bench swing and a collection of wind chimes that were active even in the cold. Gerald the cat was monumentally unimpressed by the arrival of a guest, and expressed this by sitting in the exact center of the kitchen and refusing to relocate. The pot roast was extraordinary. There were 2 pies, pecan and apple, and Lillian put both on the table and told Celeste to eat what she wanted because there were no rules about pie on Christmas Eve. They talked for 3 hours. Celeste told her about Owen, about the deployment, the letters, the Sunday calls, the way her father could communicate entire paragraphs with a single look. Lillian listened the way she had listened to thousands of students over a career, fully, without preparing her next sentence while the other person was still talking. She said at one point, "He sounds like a man who knows what matters." Celeste thought about that for a moment and said yes, he did. At 10 o'clock, without ceremony or commentary, Lillian made up the guest bedroom. Celeste slept in clean sheets under a heavy quilt, while Gerald sat in the doorway, philosophically tolerating the intrusion. The house smelled like cedar and pie crust, and something that she eventually understood was simply the smell of a home that had been properly lived in. She called her father the next morning. She said she was fine. She said she'd had a nice Christmas dinner at a neighbor's. Owen had gotten 12 minutes on the satellite phone through a favor owed to him by his communications sergeant. He spent 3 of them listening to his daughter be carefully fine, which he recognized with the same instinctive accuracy he brought to reading any situation he'd been trained to read. He asked specific questions in a specific order until Celeste, who was, constitution-wise, entirely his child, gave him the truth. He was very still on the other end of the line for a long moment. He said, "You're safe?" She said yes. He said, "Good. I'll be home in 4 months. Until then, eat as much pie as you want." She laughed. He had calculated for that, and he stored it carefully, the way he stored every piece of evidence that she was going to be all right. When he hung up, he sat outside his bunk in 18-degree dark and thought about Gale Rivers with the controlled focus of a man who knew precisely what he was feeling and had decided the feeling was useful only as fuel, not as a plan. He thought about Charlene standing in the hallway in a Christmas sweater while the door closed on her daughter. He turned both images over in his mind until he knew exactly what he intended to do, and then he put it away until he was back on American soil. He was not a reckless man. He had spent Celeste's entire life making decisions that would keep him available to be her father. That was not going to change. But something else was going to change, and he had 4 months to let the plan settle into its final shape. He came home in April. He drove from the airfield directly to Charlene's house without stopping, still in uniform, bag still in the truck. He rang the doorbell. When Charlene answered, he said he was filing a modification with family court that would give him primary custody during the school year, and that his attorney, he provided the name and the address and the direct line, had already been briefed. He said that what had occurred on December 24th was documented, and that if Charlene or her mother wanted to contest the modification, they were welcome to make that case to a judge who would be hearing it regardless. Charlene started to speak. Owen was not finished. He told her that Celeste had done nothing in her 16 years except exist, and that existing while looking like her father was not a failing that required punishment. He told her that what he'd heard from that porch in December, a child told she was unwelcome in her own family's home because she had the wrong face, was the most specific kind of cowardice he'd encountered in a career that had given him extensive comparative data. He told her that Gale Rivers could have her opinions, but that his daughter was done being the cost of those opinions. Then he left. He answered Charlene's calls on the 6th attempt, gave his attorney's information a second time, and didn't answer again. The court modification took 4 months. Primary custody during the school year went to Owen. Celeste packed her records, her 3 windowsill cacti, and a shoebox full of letters with foreign postmarks, and moved into his apartment 3 blocks from his new post. She enrolled in a school that was better than her previous one. She did well immediately, which surprised no one who knew her. She brought Lillian Farmer's phone number with her. She had it memorized. Lillian was not the kind of person whose involvement required ongoing maintenance. She and Celeste had simply, by the operation of genuine mutual regard, become part of each other's lives. Texts went back and forth. Celeste documented unusual cloud formations and the more spectacular failures of her school cafeteria. Lillian reported on Gerald's increasingly elaborate sleeping positions and the progress of her tomato garden. Celeste came to the Yellow House on holidays. Owen came the first Christmas after the custody change because Celeste wanted him there, and because, as he told himself, he wanted to thank the woman properly. He sat at Lillian's kitchen table with the same gravity he carried everywhere and watched her operate in her own space, direct, efficient, unhurried, quietly funny, and understood, without requiring an explanation, why his daughter had been drawn there. He told her, when Celeste had gone to find Gerald for a photograph, that she'd done something on one December night that he hadn't been able to do himself, and that he didn't have language sufficient for what that meant. Lillian told him to stop, that she'd done what anyone decent would have done, and then she poured him more coffee and steered the conversation back toward the living, because she was a woman who had no patience for extended sentimentality. He found this completely correct. He came back every Christmas. Eventually, he stopped needing an explicit invitation. Celeste turned 20 and left for college on an academic scholarship to study architecture. It suited her with an almost suspicious exactness. The discipline of making things that had to be beautiful and load-bearing simultaneously, that couldn't be merely aesthetic but had to justify themselves through structure, appealed to everything in her that had been shaped by a childhood spent learning to stand upright inside difficult conditions. She met Isaac Ballard at a study group in the first semester of her sophomore year. He was a mechanical engineering student from Chicago, broad-shouldered and calm, with the specific quality of paying complete attention when someone was speaking to him, rather than simply waiting for his own turn. They were friends for a year before anything shifted, each of them careful in the way of people who have seen what carelessness produces. And when it finally shifted, it shifted completely. Owen met him at Thanksgiving. He shook Isaac's hand in the way that communicated clearly that this was an assessment rather than a formality. And then he handed him a knife and asked him to debone the turkey, because in Owen Maynard's household, the table was earned through usefulness, not attendance. Isaac deboned the turkey without complaint and made a reasonable joke about structural integrity in the process. Owen's read was favorable, though he waited another 6 months before saying so. Isaac proposed when Celeste was 22, in her own apartment with no performance and no audience. Just a question he'd been working toward for the better part of a year, offered directly because he was a direct person, and she would have found ceremony irritating. She said yes, with the particular certainty of someone who had spent enough of her life distinguishing between people who stayed and people who didn't. She called Owen first. He was quiet for a beat. Then he said, "Good." He paid attention. That's the whole thing. She called Lillian second. Lillian said something warm and specific, and then said she expected a full account of the ring dimensions because she had opinions about proportion. Celeste laughed and provided them. She did not call Charlene. She had, in the years since the custody modification, fielded periodic attempts from her mother, birthday calls that came a day late, a graduation card that was signed without a personal word in it, an occasional lunch that Charlene booked and then arrived at with the slightly apologetic energy of someone who knew they were behind on a debt but hadn't figured out the conversion rate yet. Celeste attended these lunches. She was not cruel. She simply did not give Charlene access to the interior rooms, the things that mattered, the real news, the list of people you called first. That list had an order. It had been determined by 6 years of evidence, not by biology. The wedding was planned for June, 14 months out. The venue was a garden courtyard that Celeste had visited 5 times before approving, specifically because the proportions of the stone archway were structurally satisfying, and the afternoon light struck the east wall at an angle that made the whole space read warmer than it was. She had opinions about light now. She came by them honestly. Naomi Ballard, Isaac's sister, who had slid into the role of best friend over 2 years, with the organic ease of someone who fit correctly from the start, sat across from Celeste in a coffee shop 6 months into planning and asked, with the directness of someone who'd earned it, whether Charlene was going to be on the invitation. Celeste was quiet for a long stretch. She said she'd thought about it. She said she didn't hate her mother, that hate was an expensive fuel, and she'd found better uses for that energy. She said Charlene had made choices. She had been standing in the hallway. She had chosen the path of least resistance every time it had been offered, and the path of least resistance had a cost. And Celeste had been the one paying it for years, and she was done. She said there was a name she'd been considering for the invitation that wasn't her mother's. Naomi waited. Celeste said, "Lillian was the one who sat next to me. She didn't ask questions, she didn't need the story. She just held my hand." She looked at her coffee. You don't get to walk past someone when they need you and then put your name next to theirs at the altar 6 years later. You don't get to do nothing and then claim the credit for who they became. The invitations were designed, printed on heavy cream stock, and mailed. They read, "Mr. Owen Maynard and Mrs. Lillian Farmer request the honor of your presence at the marriage of their daughter, Celeste Ann Maynard." Charlene was not on the invitation. An invitation was not sent to Charlene. Owen read the proof on a Thursday evening at his kitchen table, reading glasses on, coffee getting cold. He read it once, then again. He called Celeste. He said, "You sure?" She said, "Yes." He said, "All right then." He sat for a few minutes after hanging up. The apartment was quiet. He thought, methodically, the way he thought through everything. about a porch in December, and a satellite phone call in the dark, and a woman who had answered the door of a yellow house without requiring an explanation. He thought about every Sunday call at 7 o'clock, every letter with a foreign postmark, every custody hearing, every small act of showing up that had accumulated into a life he was genuinely proud of. He thought, this is how it ends. Not with confrontation, not with a speech, with an invitation that listed 2 names and excluded 1. With the simple accounting of who had been there. He put the proof down, finished his coffee, and went back to work. The wedding was on a warm Saturday in June. The garden caught the afternoon light exactly as Celeste had calculated. Owen walked his daughter down the aisle wearing his dress uniform, not as performance but because it was who he was. And he'd decided some years ago that who he was had earned the right to be worn openly. Lillian Farmer sat in the front row on the bride's side in a deep blue dress with her hands folded in her lap, composed in the way of someone who had accepted good fortune without needing to perform surprise at it. Isaac Ballard cried at the altar. Owen saw it and filed it as a permanent credit in the man's account. Celeste stood at the altar with the expression she had always worn when she was absolutely certain, still, composed, seeing more than she was showing. And Owen looked at her and recognized every part of that face, and felt something he had no clean word for, something that was partly grief for the years that had been difficult, and partly the complete, settled satisfaction of knowing they had landed here regardless. He gave a toast that was brief and specific and, as requested, genuinely funny in 3 distinct places. He ended it by saying that the only qualification he'd ever had for fatherhood was showing up, and that showing up had turned out to be enough. He looked at Celeste when he said it. She looked back. The room held the weight of what didn't need to be added. Lillian was at the head table. She was introduced as family, because she was. Charlene found out 3 days before the wedding. It came through a secondary connection, a mutual acquaintance who had attended the same college as Celeste's former roommate, one of the many ambient social links that persist in an era where everything is photographed and shared. Celeste had posted a picture of the invitation on a Wednesday, framed on her desk, afternoon light on it, with a caption that said simply, "Almost time." The invitation was readable in the image. Charlene looked at it for a long time. She looked at the 2 names listed. She did not recognize Lillian Farmer immediately, and then she did. A vague memory surfacing, years old. Celeste mentioning something briefly during the custody transition about a woman from a church. Charlene had been on her way somewhere. She had half listened. She had not asked a follow-up question. She sat down heavily in her kitchen. Alvin was in the other room. Her mother called that afternoon, and Charlene said nothing useful because there was nothing useful to say. She picked up her phone. She called Celeste at 10 in the morning. She called again at noon. She called from her own number, and then from Alvin's, and then from a number she borrowed from a friend. She left 12 voicemails. She texted in full paragraphs and then in single lines. She sent a text that said, "Please." She sent one that said, "I am your mother." She sent one at 11 at night that said, "I know I can still come. Tell me where. I can be there." 47 calls over 3 days. Not one was answered. Not one voicemail was played. Each one went to the same quiet place where Charlene's choices had been accumulating for years, unacknowledged. Gail Rivers managed her daughter's breakdown with the fretful competence of someone accustomed to managing consequences without ever examining their origin. She told Charlene to stop calling. She said that Celeste was clearly making a statement, and that dignifying it with desperation was beneath them. She said other things that were framed as wisdom and were, structurally, the same logic she had always applied. That some people's feelings were acceptable losses when balanced against the comfort of the family. That thresholds existed and had to be maintained. That you couldn't be expected to include everyone simply because they wanted to be included. She had never once understood that the someone she'd excluded had been the one carrying the cost. She had looked at a 16-year-old girl with her father's face and decided that was a liability. She had never looked up long enough to see what she was looking at. Owen Maynard drove home from the reception at 9:30 in the evening. He had eaten well and spoken well, and danced badly at Celeste's specific request, which he had fulfilled without complaint, because she had asked, and he would refuse her very few things. He had watched his daughter and her husband move through the reception with the easy clarity of two people who had decided correctly, and he had sat at a head table next to a woman from a yellow house who handed him a second glass of champagne without comment when his first was empty. He came home to a clean apartment. He poured 2 fingers of a whiskey he had been saving for something adequate and sat by the window in the dark with it. He thought about what it had cost. The deployments, the custody hearings, the phone calls from bad time zones, the years of showing up without recognition or thanks, doing the work of being a father across distances that would have given lesser men permission to quit. He thought about December 24, 6 years ago, when he had been 7,000 miles away and there was nothing he could do, and a stranger with gray in her hair had done it instead. He thought about the invitation. 2 names, the correct 2 names. He thought about 47 unanswered calls. He was not a man who celebrated other people's pain. He was, however, a man who understood consequence. He understood that some accounts took years to settle, and that when they settled, it was not dramatic. There was no confrontation in the garden, no speech, no moment where he looked Gale Rivers in the eye and made a speech about justice. There was only a wedding that happened without them, and a daughter who had known who to call first, and the quiet, structural truth that you become the person you showed up to be. He had shown up. He finished his whiskey. The summer night was unremarkable and complete. He went to bed. In the morning there was a text from Celeste. It was a photo taken at the reception. Owen and Lillian and Celeste and Isaac at the head table, all of them mid-laugh at something. The caption said, "We looked good." He looked at it for a long time. Then he typed back, "We did." He set the phone down and started the coffee. Outside, the world was continuing without requiring anything of him today, and that, after everything, was exactly enough.